Welcome back. This is lecture 2 of module 8. In module 8, we are looking at language with respect to social cognition, as to how language structure reflects the way a particular community looks at the world, how they cognize the world and how their understanding reflects to their language use as well as the general behavior or the world view. So, lecture 2 will talk about models, supracultural models or cultural models. This is what we will look at in terms of how the language or the way a particular level of cognition works. One of the most famous studies of this kind of a supracultural model has to do with the idea of personhood. How do you see, how does one person see oneself with respect to the society at large? So, based on these there are different takes on the status of an individual within the broader society. In the collectivist, so we often talk about collectivist culture versus the individualistic culture, that is something very common. So, in the western countries it is considered that the societies are individualistic, individual beings take their own decision, individuals chart their way of life and everything, whereas oriental societies are more collectivist. So, this is the idea of personhood. Where does your how much do you allow the society to shape the way you want to go ahead in life, this kind of ideas. So, this is one area that has been studied a lot and often juxtaposing the western with the oriental. So, oriental occidental difference, in this case Chinese and American. So, expectations of what a human life would look like, individual human life would look like, and how the individual relates to family and society, that has been the idea that has been studied. This is now famous study, very famous study. UC Berkeley students took part in discussion on a number of topics. For example, this is one topic where they took part. The participants were Chinese and English, that is American students as well as Chinese students. So, one topic is like this: Tom is about to graduate from school. He decides he does not want to go to college despite his parents' wishes. He instead wants to join a rock band. What will the family members all say to one another? What will happen in the end? Who is right? So, this is the kind of story that is given to the participants in the study. This is a scenario where they are completing school, and then after school they of course they go to college, but the particular person that we are talking about, Tom, he does not want to go to college, he wants to join a rock band. Now, what will happen? Now, this is a scenario. Now, they are looking at how the responses will work out. So, the US responses, the respondents had more support for follow your dream model with cautionary note informed by success. So, in the case of the US students, they followed more of what I want to do, I will do. Sometimes some respondents say that okay, fine, you have to be careful, but still you do what you want to do, follow your own dream, not the society's dream or the family's dream. So, for example, A says that I guess if he has lot of talent and he really wants to do it. B says I think he should do it. Again A, I think he should do it, because I mean you have only one life, right? Do what you want. B, let's see if it was my kid, seeing as how I am at the university working my butt off trying to get my degree, I would probably be kind of upset at him. I worked so hard and I am at the university really working very hard. So, if my child does not want to go to college, I will be upset, probably. No, I know I would be very upset with him. I would want him to go to college, because chances are it is not very good. But I mean, and yet I just said that he should go and pursue his dreams. I do not know. I will probably let him do it despite my wishes. This is kind of often it is understood as a standpoint by many of the US respondents. So, they understand that it is probably a good idea to go to college, complete your education, get more degrees, but at the same time I can also see that if that is his dream, he might as well should follow that, I might as well allow him to do that. I do not want an unhappy kid. and I do not want him to hate me for the rest of my life. So, you see the parameters, what are the important things here, what are they taking into account while they are discussing and judging what Tom should do. Now, look at the Chinese response. This is quoted from the study. Now, here the emphasis was more on success in terms of public perception as well as economic considerations. Follow your dream is never explicitly advocated by any of the respondents, although the model is available. So, there is a stark difference between the US and the Chinese response. US they deal with both the topics, both the possibilities, and ultimately go with follow your dream. In Chinese case, they do not go with that option at all. They talk about success and public perception of success and so on. So, I think I would support his parents, because in fact, after he has finished college, he can still have all sorts of interests and hobbies to be developed in all sorts of ways. But I think knowledge level is an important aspect in determining this person's quality. So, it is no problem for him to start his rock band after college. Sounds familiar? In India also we think like this, because in India we give a lot of importance to education, and the degree also gets respect in the society. So, public perception, log kya kahenge kind of thing, and it is unthinkable that you will not get educated. If you have the option to get educated, you do get educated. That is how the Oriental response typically is. So, Chinese and Indians will typically respond in this way. So, here there is a difference between follow your dream versus follow what the society expects of you. This is what the primary difference is. So, some US students also use the model of live and learn. For example, one person says you could let him go with his band thing, and if it takes off great, and if it does not, then he will realize that he needs to do other things. The hard way? Yeah, the hard way. So, another group of students responded this way, okay, let him do whatever he wants to do. Once he finds out that it is not so easy, he will come back, he will come around. So, he has to find. So, there is no point advising him. Let him learn it through when he faces the tough challenges in life, then he will know, and he will know, that is what he said. But at least he will learn, right? Yes, he will know, that is the idea. So, whatever it is there, it is up to the person to figure out what is best for him or her. That is the baseline understanding among the US respondents. So, as a result of this, the author, the patent lists 7 cultural models based on this study. So, success, follow your dream, live and learn, you can't change me, independence, good reason, disclosure. These are the models that he proposes. So, each of the students, they gave their own response, and as a result of that, this is what he came out with. So, though all of these are available to both the groups, there is a specific tendency towards some of them by each of them. So, all of these are available. The Chinese students are now in US. So, they also have these models available to them, but they do not use them. So, it is not like whether you can or you cannot, but the preferential treatment of one model over another is what they are talking about here. So, each culture has its own way of looking at personhood. In the Indian scenario also, of course, things are now changing a bit, but Indian scenario also is looking up to individualism as the way to go. So, if you dream of becoming a rock band singer or a rock band member, children might as well be allowed to do that. But more often than not, the parents and the society's expectations are typically the ones that are that weigh heavily on the student's mind. Foundational schemas, the idea of foundational schemas that comes from that. So, many models specific to particular aspects of culture together create what is considered a foundational schema. This has been given by Bradshaw. So, not all cultural models have all encompassing foundational schema. Many cultural models are special purpose models. On the other hand, there are those models that are linked through foundational schema contributing to the sense, the common world view of the community. So, while these models that we talked about might be specific to certain specific situations, but communities at the same time may have some some foundational schema that that is typical of that particular community. That is what the idea is. So, an example that he gives is could be the Americans' fascination with argument as a means of resolving various kinds of discussions or various kinds of topics. So, they use argument as a tool. This is considered a foundational schema for the Americans. Now, how do you know that is the case? This is something that we see in many domains. For example, the author gives example of lawyer versus lawyer, courtroom battle, CNN's Crossfire, there is a program called Crossfire, presidential debates and so on and so forth. So, through argument, through debates, through discussions, one comes to a conclusion about a particular topic. So, this is considered a foundational schema for the American psyche. But why are these things important? Why are cultural schemas important? Why do we need to even study them? The reason is that this is the underlying framework through which we tend to interact with the world around us. We may not always understand or realize this. This is not also not often conscious decision. This is what we embody, and this is at the back of our interaction with the rest of the world, with our other people within the same community as well as people from the other community. So, that is why it is important. Though the communities are not homogeneous by any standards, it is common to see some particular supracultural models take precedence over others in a given society. So, even though any society, all societies are heterogeneous by nature, but even then there are certain kinds of models that take precedence over others within any given community. So, there are certain things that are typical to a community, let us say. So, let us look at some examples now. The idea of privacy. So, how do you understand privacy? You can juxtapose the idea of privacy in case of, let us say, in a congested space, like in a flight, in a aeroplane conversation, where you are sitting next to a stranger and you are talking to somebody over phone. What is the concept of privacy there? Now, this juxtapose this at home, your entire home, even the boundary, the garden, everything is within the purview of your private space. So, this is what changes in terms of how we negotiate that idea of privacy in public and private places, that has been studied. So, as a result, what we know is that it is often a difficult task to respect privacy and personal space. So, how do we do that? We use indirect speech acts, for example. So, in the aeroplane, it is not very uncommon to find somebody else sitting in your seat. How do we do that? So, we will say, is this row 8 looks like this is my seat. So, we will not say get up and get lost, this is my seat. This is not how we talk. We get into the, of course, it is a possibility, but typically people do not use that kind of a language. So, you are in a formal scenario, you are with strangers, but your privacy is interrupted, or it has been invaded upon. So, you use an indirect speech. This is one such example. And in some places the target person may rise, make way for you and let you go inside. Sometimes they may argue and become viral on social media immediately as well. We see a lot of fights in the flights, airplane fights in the social media. So, they might argue, they might just say no, it is my seat. It happens quite often. So, another situation is retrieving your armrest. Anybody who has gone through this experience may understand this. Now, some example from cross cultural data. In Turkish, they had this revolution, language revolution in Turkey. So, what they did was, there was a lot of changes that took place in the language structure. So, when the idea of Ataturk, when he proposed the idea of purifying the language, so older words borrowings made way for Turkish words. So, Turkish words so language purity was a concern there. So, as a result of which many of the borrowed words were discarded, they fell into disuse, and the Turkish words took their place, older Turkish words took their place. So, as a result of which a lot of changes, semantic extension, repurposing of the words, all of that happened. So, Turkish word Özel has taken over a collection of words like these. Now the Özel had the meaning of personal, peculiar, special, private. Now, the word also means non-government, public, private, personalized, privileged, unique and so on. That is what the idea of what is private and what is public and so on and so forth. So, when the language revolution was taking place, these are the changes that happened. However, Ozel does not include private in the strict sense, that is what the private as in your privacy of your home, your personal privacy and so on and so forth. So, for that another word merem is used. Thus, Turkish identifies two levels of privacy which are shown through these two words. So, in terms of usage, Ozel allows for more flexibility. On the other hand, merem applies to domain that should not be talked about. So, what is private? Strictly private, something that you should not talk about. So, as a result of which the second term is used less. Thus, Ozel Okul is private school. Ozel can also mean personal. So, this is how language tells you how the society deals with what is private and what is not. Finnish has a more, there are various words in here also. So, they have this particular word, it means a more general meaning including tranquility, freedom from social control and so on. Thus, close proximity with other people, social obligation etc., are at odds, they want to keep to themselves. In any case, the Scandinavian people typically do not like small talk, they do not like meaningless chatter and so on. So, they respect privacy, they respect quietude and solitude, and they also respect silence. So, this idea of this means tranquility and freedom from social control. On the other hand, they have another word which refers to individual thought, personal space, family matters and so on and so forth, and this one which refers to solitude, intimate privacy of a personal kind. Now, the changes to the nouns related to privacy in both Turkish and Finnish are related to social changes. What happened in Finland was the population engaged in farming went from 42% in 1950s to 2%, just 2% in 2006. As a result, influx from rural to urban areas increased significantly, because when you are not farming, when you are not participating in farming activities, naturally you move from rural to urban area, and that will result in changes in the language structure. So, houses were smaller in the early days with more members sharing the same space, but the sparse population in rural areas meant they lived in relative isolation from others. But now, their living conditions are better, but there is a constant interaction with strangers. The Finnish people, they put emphasis on quietude, as I said, and in the changed living condition, now we need to understand the emergence of salience of Omaruha. So, the way the word, the concept is used has changed post the mass migration from the rural to the urban area. Similar social changes more in terms of religious fabric after the 1980s is what we see in Turkey. Expanded use for Ozel. So, initially Ozel was used for particular purposes, now this is used for a larger number of domains as opposed to the way it was used before. Thus, both languages, though they lacked a noun to mean privacy in the usual sense of it, none of the words had a word that could strictly be called the meaning on the word for privacy, but they have repurposed it, semantic extension has been utilized and so on, and the changing social scenarios saw adaptation of old words for new meanings. So, this is contrary to Sapir-Whorf theory. Here language adapts to society and does not regulate the viewing of it. So, as the society social structures change, the overall fundamental schemas also change and the language accordingly adjusts rather than limiting it. Now, casting social identities through narratives, Spanish language doctrina classes for Mexican immigrants in Los Angeles, it has been studied intensively, and this is a very interesting study actually. Through the narrative of the apparition of, this is a religious, these are classes that took place, probably still takes place in the church. Now, in the church they have this particular story that talks about a particular apparition, Our Lady of Guadalupe. The church constructs a social identity using the look. The story goes back to a time immediately after the Spanish Inquisition. Now, all of us know that the southern part of America and many other places, the Spanish Inquisition happened. So, over a very short period of time, Spanish became the language. the indigenous languages were stopped, they were stopped from speaking in those languages. Most of the people were killed, but the remaining people were not allowed to speak in that language. Same thing happened here as well. So, what happened was in the 1531, the Spanish Inquisition of Mexico, in this case the Aztecs were vanquished, dehumanized and conquered, as it happened in many other places where colonial powers went. So, according to the story, Mother of God herself appeared in a vision to a peasant asking him to evangelize. The trick in this story is that this is a group, Aztec speaking Aztec community, many of whom has been killed by the Spanish. Now, the story that was there is that one of the members from the Aztec community had a vision of the Christian goddess, not their own god, Christian, the god herself appears in her vision and asks her to evangelize his people, to evangelize the entire conquered people. These are the people who have lost their language, their culture, their heritage, religion, everything, and then through them apparently the god appears to one of them and asks them to evangelize the whole. So, basically convert the community to Christianity, which is the religion of the conquerors. Now, the interesting part of this story is that the Virgin Mary appeared as an Aztec, not as a Spanish person, but as an Aztec speaking the local language, the language of the Aztecs. This is how the apparition appeared. Now, this story is used in the church services, and this is in the Doctrina classes. It has been claimed that this narrative has been used to define and redefine the political identity of the Mexican people from time to time. Over a period of time, every phase of history, this story has been utilized for creating and recreating the political identity of the conquered people. Initially, by giving them the story, through this story, they were turned into Spanish speaking Christian locals who converted to Christianity. So, Doctrina classes have been used for reinforcing political and linguistic uniformity among the newly converted indigenous people, and these classes were used to impose Castilian Spanish. This is the language of the conqueror. So, Spanish has Castilian and Catalan Spanish, Castilian is the more prestigious form. So, these classes where this story was told, retold over and over, and the language that was used was Spanish, the Castilian Spanish. By 1770, so 1531 to 1770, a royal decree by the Spanish court mandated the use of Castilian in Mexico. So, by now the conversion is complete, the people will now speak Castilian Spanish, not anymore their indigenous language. So, this is the idea was to completely eradicate the indigenous language by that time. By 1770, indigenous language was completely eradicated. Eventually, this ensured the spread of Spanish language in all other aspects of Aztec life. So, starting with the religious life, the language has gotten into all aspects of Aztec life. So, thus religious instruction socialized children not just to religious tenets, but also to the dominant language. This is how language can be used through narratives to change the entire worldview of the people. In due course of such a long time, the people in this parish started to identify the colonizers' language as their own language. They even called it language of hurt. The colonizers' language, which was imposed on them in a very rude, in a very in a very sad way, they over a period of time they are identified with that language as the language of hurt, illustrating the achieved goal of Spanish friars. In a Doctrina class, the teacher first starts by situating the narrative in the capital of Mexico and asking her pupils if and how many are Mexicans. Thus, the class gets divided into Mexicans and the people from here. So, the setting is modern day US. When the study was carried out, this is modern day US. So, in the class, the teacher will first start by asking who are from Mexico and who are from here as in US, in spite of the fact that they have been here for some time. The narrative therefore creates an ethnic identity of some type. In the 1970s, a new debate started. So, it was like you see through historically through various phases, different kinds of things happened to the same community. So, in 1970s a new debate emerged. The Doctrina classes continued in Spanish, whereas there were parallel church activities in English within a community that was largely bilingual. Now, cut to 1970s, the community now is bilingual. They speak Spanish, they do not anymore speak their mother tongue, which is lost a couple of 100 years back. Now, they speak Spanish as their mother tongue and English as their L2. So, bilingual for all purposes, they are bilingual. The doctrina classes are still held in Spanish, but other church activities have moved to English language. The English classes were called different, they were called catechism classes. The participants here are now large in number and they feel the doctrina group to be superstitious. So, over a period of time, English has become dominant. 200 years back, Spanish was dominant, now English is dominant. As a result, English classes are larger compared to the Spanish classes. English is now the dominant language. So, and hence continuing to use Spanish in a specific cases fostered the image of a separate parish within the larger. So, this is within the same church, within the same parish, there is a division now, who speaks English and who speaks only Spanish, or who prefers to use English over Spanish. In 1996 April, the parish council voted to eliminate doctrina, meaning the classes that were being held in Spanish, that was considered to, that was eliminated. This is how you can see a single setting, single group of people over a period of few hundred years, how the identity was created and recreated using different kinds of tools. Language is one of the important tools of them. Then let us look at the idea of self in cultural cognition. We have looked at some of the examples in the previous lecture in terms of the Persian way of looking at it through different kinds of words, pronoun and noun. The same has also been investigated through behavioral experiments across linguistic communities. The idea here is to check if the notion has different repercussions. Now, the idea of self is different between Oriental and Occidental, like all things that we have discussed before. So, Chinese as well as Indic philosophy from antiquity talks of self as a part of an all encompassing consciousness. The idea of self is not separate, it is not different entity or unique entity, separate from the rest of the world around us. So, this is something that is part of the Indian philosophy as well. Chinese also has similar idea. However, often the focus in these traditions is on transcending the self. So, you have to get out of your own egoistic understanding of who you are and then get into the higher consciousness. So, that is what is part of the Oriental philosophy. So, Chinese philosopher he puts it thus: a person is a knot in the net, with the only exception being that he is able consciously to think of the self, that is, has self consciousness and is capable of transcending itself. So, you do not transcend yourself by not knowing it, you are conscious about it and then you are supposed to transcend yourself. Western philosophy on the other takes self for granted. Aristotle suggested the whole self, soul and body alike is something given and not questioned. Knowing yourself is the beginning of wisdom. You can see the difference here between Oriental and Occidental understanding of self, and this is the entire Western philosophy is similar, if not exactly the same one. So, studies have looked at this differential attitude towards cultural conceptualization of self in terms of their psychological processing. For example, studies have found that adults show advantage in self-face identification as opposed to other familiar or unfamiliar faces when there was a task requiring them to do so explicitly or implicitly. However, this self-face advantage was found to be more salient among British than Chinese. So, self-face versus another face, if you just change use it as a variable and then give them a task where this identification of the face is important, there is an impact which is different between the Western and the Eastern participants. So, in case of the British, the self face has a deeper impact, or you can say a face advantage is found, and the advantage is less in case of the Chinese. Even more interestingly, the self face identification was found to be susceptible to influence of viewing significant others faces, meaning self face identification was either slowed or faster with respect to faces of others more important people. So, like in the case of self face versus advisor, advisor as in supervisor in case of Indian context. So, presence of one's advisor's face significantly slowed down the Chinese respondents' self face recognition time. These are experimental studies. So, if you have your supervisor's face and then you have to recognize self face, then there is an impact of the other's face on that. This type of finding typically point to the fact that self identification, often called the self referential processing, is culturally constructed. This comes directly from the cultural conceptualization of self. How important is your own self to you? In the Oriental understanding, this is just part of the larger bigger whole. In the Western understanding, self is very important. It is rather salient, so to say. Memory tasks have also been carried out in a different type of behavioral task. Memory measures were used called self-referential memory task. What was the task? Participants were given a list of trait adjectives and asked to determine if they reflect their own or somebody else's traits. So, somebody else could be close family member, friend, public figures or whatever. So, basically adjectives, let us say lazy or happy or sad or workaholic or like this, various kinds of adjectives, and they had to match them with either their own or somebody else's as either their own or somebody else's traits. The task conditions, they had to identify the words from the list. Was this word part of the list? So, the word will be given and they were asked to, this is a memory task. So, they will be asked whether this word was there in the original list, like this the study went. The results showed higher performance in traits that were related to self even when contrasted with close family members. This is from the Western participants. So, higher participation, so those traits that were understood to be connected to self, they identified them better when it comes to Western participants. Chinese participants on the other hand remembered equally well the traits that were for self as well as those of the others. So, when they had to in the memory task, when they had to remember whether this trait was there in the previous list, whether it is their own trait or somebody else's, they remembered them equally well. For the Westerners, they remembered their own traits better, not the others. That is the simplified way we can look at it. So, this has been attributed as the previous studies also, the way the Westerners versus the Easterners I understand the autonomous entity, that is the self, whether it is autonomous, whether it is not autonomous or whatever. The findings from behavioral studies in place, neural signature also was studied, how neural signature as in how the brain processes this kind of stimuli, do they process them similarly, do they process it differently, like this that was studied. They used fMRI. So, fMRI studies found distinct neural signature for personality trait judgments as opposed to different tasks, motor or perception tasks. Some specific areas like ACC, anterior cingulate cortex, and MPFC, medial prefrontal cortex, these were the areas that were the point of study. So, in a study contrasting again Chinese and Danish participants, differing activation pattern was observed in the ventral MPFC for tasks for self versus other judgment. So, basically the long story cut short, not only we know that the Chinese, the Eastern versus Western understanding of self are different, but also we see that they are processed differently in both in the behavioral studies as well as in the brain imaging studies. Even the brain reacts differently in terms of the Eastern versus Western participants. In the brain performs differently in terms of this kind of judgment of on the stimuli related to self. Similarly, self reflection on social roles activated temporoparietal junction among Chinese, but not the Danish. So, different areas were activated. So, the brain region that gets activated were also different between the Danish and the Chinese. So, this is where we complete lecture 2 of this module. In the third lecture, we will look up some other variables. Thank you.